Okay, you're live.
Okay, thank you, Roland. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Board of Education Policy Committee meeting. Today is Tuesday, May 3rd, and it's 5:34. So this evening, I have Godfrey Azima with me, Brenda Wilcox-Williams, and Natalia Sierra Milan. So again, thank you for everyone to be here. We are a little short on members today. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to table the minutes that we had today to go over. Don't have everybody here to look at those. And I just want to confirm with Roland or Brenda, do we have any public comments? Because I didn't have any emails.
We have received no public comments for this meeting tonight.
Thank you. All right, and with that, I am going to turn this over to you, Brenda.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good evening. So tonight we are going to do a continuation of work that the committee started last time in taking a look at our school climate and our bullying policies. And with that in mind, we reached out to Shipman and Goodwin and asked them to join us this evening and to take a look with us at the policies that we have in place and to give us an overview about their recommendations that we should be taking a look at to make sure that our policies reflect the most recent changes in the statutes and work that may be required to bring them up to date. So with that, I welcome Natalia, appreciate her time here today, and ask her to start with her feedback on that. We do have two policies that we had taken a look at, one last week, the policy 5131.91, which is the bullying and safe school climate. And then Norwalk also had an adult bullying policy on the books as well that we want to just take a look at in conjunction with the other work. So Natalia, over to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be with all of you today, particularly to discuss such an important policy. As you may very well imagine, bullying has been the subject of conversation in Connecticut for a very long time. And because it has been the subject of so much conversation in the legislature, there have been significant changes that have taken place over time. But most recently, in July of 2021, the definition of bullying changed. So I took a quick look at Brenda's request at your current policy, and it was last updated in 2011, which was some time ago, and there have been revisions to the law since then. So I think it's a very opportune time and a very important exercise to undergo for the committee to review this policy. Now, you know, I'm at the board's mercy in terms of what you want, how you would like me to sort of share the information. But one of the things that we did was we reviewed your policy in contrast to our model policy. As you may know, Shipman and Goodwin has a model policy project which provides policies, model policies for school districts across Connecticut. And those policies are generally just a very general statement of the law. And those policies are accompanied by administrative regulations. And those regulations are typically more meaty. You know, that's sort of the policies, the bare bones of this is sort of where the board stands on these issues. And then the administrative regulations are sort of how do we effectuate this policy and how do we put it into practice. And as you, I'm sure you very well know, because you do this work probably more so than I do, administrative regulations are changed by the superintendent without the need for approval by the board. And so that's why sometimes we, that's why we as a firm have always made recommendations related to sort of beefing up the content of the administrative regulations to ensure that our practices are consistent and up to date, because it's much easier for the superintendent to make changes to the administrative regulations without needing to go to the policy subcommittee and then the board. But it's very important that the board oversee, of course, the policy structure, because those are essentially your laws, right? As a Board of Education, that is the law, that's what you abide by, and that's what you hold everybody accountable to. So with that in mind, I'm happy to share my screen and sort of share some of the general things that, that I saw in need of changing in your policy. But before I do that, if I may, I want to just highlight some of the things generally that I think need to be revised. And I'll do that first. And then what I'm happy to do is send Brenda our model policy, our bullying model policy, because I think you'll quickly see that there have been significant changes to the law, and that revising your policy might be a bit more involved than simply taking a look at the model policy that we provide and perhaps adopting that with whatever local, nuances you want to insert to your policy. So let me sort of highlight some of the high altitude areas that I think would need some addressing in your current policy. And then I can offer just the opportunity to take a look at the model policy more generally, and hopefully that'll be the easiest way, because you have a very difficult job and you only meet once a month for an hour. So I think it's sort of this Herculean effort to have to undergo a complete revision of a policy in just one meeting. So let me just share some of the things that I identified as I went through your policy. The most significant of the changes in the law has been the definition of bullying. The old definition of bullying required things like a repetitive act of sorts. It required very strict definitions. The new definition of bullying has been updated to include a completely new standard. And the standard very much mirrors the harassment standard. So in order for bullying to be substantiated, the standard is direct or indirect and severe, persistent, or pervasive conduct. And then there are 3 subsequent prongs of analysis that are in there and that are in our model policy. But that's the most critical piece, I think, that needs addressing, is the definition of bullying. Because as you analyze, particularly in the school context, the student context, as you analyze any complaints of bullying, you need to make sure that you analyze them under the new definition, because that is the new standard prescribed by the law as of July 1st of 2021. So it's been some time since that has been sort of enacted. And so I think it's a good idea to take a look at that. The other thing that I think is helpful is, and our model policy includes it, which your policy currently does not, is sort of a definition for teen dating violence. We have our own definition, which I'll share with you in our model policy. I think whenever we are taking a position against a specific issue, I think it's a good idea to define it so that people know what we're talking about. And so we in our model policy offer a definition, which you may want to consider as a subcommittee. The other thing I noticed was that the policy you currently have has definitions for things like mobile electronic devices, electronic communication, a hostile environment, and some other things. Our model policy doesn't include definitions for those specific terms, because the definitions are embedded in the law already. That being said, the terms that you have in your policy are consistent with the law. And so to the extent that you want to keep those definitions in there, you can. So when you look at our model policy, you'll see that things like mobile electronic device is not defined. Electronic communication is not defined. Hostile environment, what it means to be outside of the school setting, what it means to be a school employee. Again, our model policy doesn't include those, but your definitions are consistent with the law, and so it's perfectly fine if you want to keep them in there to just give the public more information. The other thing that I think is going to be important that you consider as a board as it relates to this bullying policy is the definition of school climate. As I mentioned, these things are very fluid and they change quite frequently, and so the definition has changed. It includes new language. And I think we need to revise it to include that language in place of what you currently have. And the definition, I'll just read it out loud so that as you're reading our policy, you can identify it. It's defined as the quality and character of school life based on patterns of students, parents, and guardians and school employees' experiences of school life, including but not limited to norms, goals, values, interpersonal relationships, teaching and learning practices, and organizational structures. And that is defined in the very same piece of legislation, which is the Public Act 19166, as those terms that I previously mentioned you defined. So the school climate one is the only one that's outdated and needs to be updated to be consistent with the law. So that's also something that our model policy will be able to help you with. We also don't define in our model policy what a safe school climate coordinator is or a safe school climate specialist. That doesn't mean you can't. Your current policy does include that. And those definitions are consistent with that with Connecticut General Statutes 10-222K. So it's perfectly fine to continue to include that in there should you want to. I think, and maybe I should have mentioned this at the outset, our policies are very bare boned in that we provide what the law says. You know, this is what the law says and nothing else. We tend to err on the side of being overly simplistic. And that is just, you know, a strategic decision on our part in wanting to sort of limit the exposure of any Board of Education to ensure that they don't overpromise and underdeliver. Sometimes when we have policies that include a lot of different language and a lot of different promises, you know, people can point to a policy and say, but you say in your policy that you're going to do X. How is it that you have accomplished X? And sometimes they go, oh, yikes, well, we can't possibly achieve X this year. And so we err on the side of just strictly identifying the issues that the law requires you to identify. So, you know, that doesn't mean that you can't include other things. It's just, I wanted to just note that so that you have some context for why our policies are a little shorter than the ones you may be used to. Actually, I'll leave it. I'll pause there for a minute and ask if you have any questions about that so far.
I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to say, you know, especially for the public, that, you know, I'm thankful that you're here with us and discussing this big policy, and that I think we won't make a decision this evening. We will get started, and hopefully we'll do, even if we have to do a special meeting prior to the next one, just so that we can get it ready sooner rather than later. We can do that too.
Oh, terrific. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I so appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues. Like I mentioned, bullying is one of those moving targets. Mm-hmm. And every legislative session, we're constantly eyeing whatever the legislature is considering, only because it is a topic that's very much on the forefront of everyone's minds whenever they're considering these issues. Particularly, you know, lately, it's been quite a significant struggle for some students all across the state and across the nation. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to just share my screen and share the model policy that we have. What you'll see highlighted in the policy itself are the areas that are not included in your current policy. It's because I just wanted to make sure that I identified those for you. So whatever you see in yellow highlight are areas that your current policy does not include. Okay, so let me share my screen so you can see that.
Godfrey, did you have anything to say? I know that you're driving.
Just one question regarding the teen dating violence policy. I think I had drove through a dead zone area. Did you say that the policy we have now reflects what's embedded in the law pertaining to teen dating violence, or did I misunderstand that?
So teen dating violence in our policy, in the Shipman and Goodwin policy, is defined. What I mentioned is that in your policy, it is not defined. And we define teen dating violence to mean, you know, any physical or emotional or sexual abuse. And that includes stalking, it includes harassment, it includes any threatening behavior. And that is typically that occurs between two students that are currently in relationships or have been in relationships. So we define it more specifically because it's important to identify those areas that you are you have jurisdiction over, so that people are aware of what the terms mean. So I think it would be a good idea to define that and important to define that as you consider changes.
Thank you.
Of course, my pleasure. Okay, so let me share my screen very quickly. Let me just make sure I find the correct one. Okay, and as you'll see, our model policies, which I'll share as soon as I can send it to Brenda and I can send it to the committee members. Our model policies are all put together in a Word format, so they're easily manipulated, you know, by simply just searching through terms or modifying it as you want. So you can take it and make it as your own as you discuss this further. So first, I'll just go really quickly and I'll just show you that our policy is very succinct and it just includes very specific information that is highlighted in the law. Let me just actually stop this really quickly. Hold on. I think I opened the wrong one. I just want to make sure. Okay, sorry about that. I had opened the wrong document. I wanted to make sure that I have the right one. Okay, so our policy is very succinct and it's it just identifies all of the statutory obligations that we have under the law. And it starts by committing to creating and maintaining an educational environment that is essentially safe and free from bullying, that's also free from teen dating violence, and it's free from harassment and discrimination. So it starts off by saying all of that. And all of that information is pretty consistent with what you have, although we use perhaps different words, it's totally fine. Then you have this highlighted area is language that is not currently included in your policy. And what we do, and you'll see when you get the Word document and you can manipulate it yourself, you'll see that we embed the consequences of violating the policy or the potential consequences of violating this policy. We connect it to our discipline, suspension, and expulsion policy, right? And we say, if you violate this, you can be subject to school discipline in accordance with our policies on the issue and in accordance and with state and federal law. So we just tie it together. Then the most critical piece, like I mentioned at the very beginning, is the new definition of bullying. And as you see here, it says it's a direct or indirect and severe, persistent, or pervasive act, which causes physical or emotional harm, places an individual in reasonable fear of physical or emotional harm, and infringes on the rights or opportunities of an individual at school. Did I, Godfrey, did I hear you say something, or was that maybe I just heard?
I thought I heard something too, but no, he's still on mute.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't me.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure we didn't lose you.
So anyhow, so that is the new definition. And at a minimum, my recommendation is that you absolutely change that, because the standard in the law has changed for almost a year now. And so it's important that we make sure we analyze all of the complaints of bullying moving forward under the new standard, as we probably should have been doing for some time. Teen dating violence is the definition. That is included in ours. It's not included in yours. So that is something for the board to consider as well. Our Safe School Climate Plan identifies a bunch of different things that are consistent with your current plan. But we have things such as this area highlighted here that your plan does not have. And it says that parents or guardians of the student alleged to have committed an act or acts of bullying, and the parents or guardians of the student against whom such alleged act or acts were directed receive prompt notice such that such investigation has commenced. That is a requirement under the law. So it's important that we include that procedural requirement in whatever policy we have moving forward. It's also important to include a prevention and intervention strategy for school employees to deal with bullying and teen dating violence. We have to do that as a matter of practice. So it's important that we identify that we're doing that, and we're committed to doing that in our policy. And this is also new language that changed as a result of that public act that changed things on July 1st of 2021. So all of these are really to bring the policy up to date, and it requires some additional notification and some explanation of rights to parents. Now, interestingly, we need to provide a plain language explanation of the rights and remedies available under Connecticut General Statute Section 10-4A and 10-4B. That definition should have been included at the state Department of Education website. It has not yet been defined, but we can read the law, and so we're happy to provide that definition. It's not, a significant undertaking in that regard. The other thing that it's important to put in there, it's also another procedural requirement that became necessary as a result of changes in the law, and that is this number 10 that I have highlighted for you here. We are required to invite the parents or guardians of a student who commit any verified acts of bullying to a meeting that is separate and distinct from the meeting, which is required here. And that is to discuss specific interventions undertaken by the school to prevent further acts of bullying moving forward. So in other words, it's a much more involved process, and it's it requires a lot more documenting and meeting with the families. But all of this is to bring your current practice up to date so that it's consistent with the legal requirements as of July 1st of 2022.
Natalia.
Yes, sir.
How much does it matter that our policy is aligned with the local juvenile policy enforced by police? Bullying. I'm not sure if when you say it's captured under the new statute, that also encompasses changes that also reflect in juvenile related laws.
That's a very interesting question. And I don't think that I've ever been asked that question. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to think through it. I think, I think they're somewhat separate and distinct in a way, in that the obligations that school districts have as it relates to bullying is different than the obligations the police would have in a way. With respect to student discipline, I'll give you a very, silly example, but student searches, we have a different standard than the police has for student searches. When it comes to disciplining our kids, for example, or interviewing our kids, we don't have to Mirandize our kids, but the police does. And so we operate under very different structures. They're not entirely foreign to each other, but they are somewhat different because our standards of proof are different. Our ability to access students sometimes without parental consent is different. It's different. It's difficult to impossible for a police officer to interview kids without parental consent if they're minors. But for us, from a disciplinary perspective, we can interview kids. So the worlds are a little different, even though we may be talking about the same thing. But you raise a very good point. I think, to the extent that there are, I don't know whether there's a juvenile review board in Norwalk. I'm not familiar. I've never worked.
There is, but in the changes that happened to juvenile laws a few years back, it's changed really the role of how interventions are connected and part of the process in responding to anything. That change is created by the local jurisdiction. And then my question around bullying, thinking of a scenario, if a parent, his child was a victim of bullying, and they then went to seek police support to address it, whether charges can be pressed or however the police have jurisdiction to get involved in a juvenile matter. If we haven't, went through our steps in verifying that the bullying did occur along the lines of the new standard, does that prohibit police from getting involved, and carrying out any charges parents are asking to be pressed, or just even their involvement period, just to ensure we're not operating in two definitions, which is kind of where my mind is wandering and looking at this policy in action.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the one parallel analysis that I can offer you is Title IX and circumstances where DCF has to get involved. We both have independent obligations under the law to take a look at what happened and make factual determinations.
And we, for the point of clarification, is when you say we the legal team.
We the district. I'm sorry. Okay, I all of a sudden became. I all of a sudden made myself part of the district.
So you are part of the district for sure. It's encompassing the word we.
Yes. So I think it's a very good question, and I think the best way I can answer it is we have an independent obligation from the police. I always think that, particularly in extreme cases, it's appropriate and sometimes necessary to collaborate with the police on some of these matters, but that doesn't mean that we can just do away with our responsibility to investigate the underlying bullying complaint. Because there are going to be many circumstances in which the standard of proof or the evidence that we have is not significant enough for the police to get involved. And so we shouldn't delay our processes, for as long as the police needs to make that determination, because at the end of the day, we have children that require a safe school environment in which to learn. And so we need to address that immediately. But like I mentioned, in those really extreme circumstances where police intervention is necessary and, probably very appropriate, I think it's important to ensure that we collaborate on these issues so that we also don't infringe on their ability to make sure that they investigate things properly. So I think it'll be a combination of both. I think we have independent obligations, but there are times where our obligations we're going to be on the same team, and we're going to need to work hard to ensure that we're able to make findings of fact that are appropriate. I hope that answered your question.
It didn't. Somehow I understood it. Might be because this is how I wanted to understand it. Is that there's an opportunity here that requires us to really define how bullying looks. And in every sense I've referenced bullying, it's always been in the context of school of it being conduct that isn't allowed. But I haven't engaged in conversations, been in conversations where it's illegal to bully, and acknowledging kind of the power that lies within our jurisdiction. I was hoping and thought that this was an opportunity to kind of create a community response to bullying as well, because just in my experience, any report of bullying brought to a police station, and their line of questioning involves what the school has done, where the school is with it, what documentation exists from the school around these issues pertaining to bullying, because of the awareness of, like, you know, what the onus is on the school for doing their due diligence. But, you know, I wanted to prevent an issue where I know when police get involved, they have their own policies that they follow, and it's a dicey slope, you know, when there are policies that aren't clear for how they engage in addressing a school matter, or vice versa. You know, and it sounds like it's not defined.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the police is always going to want as much information as they have available to them. So I think asking information related to what we have done as a school district might be important for them. And I don't want to overstep my boundary here, because I am not a police officer in any way, nor law enforcement, nor do I have any law enforcement background. But I would think that finding out what, if anything, we have done might be significant for them to understand perhaps whether safety is an issue. Perhaps, you know, if we've put in some sort of safety plan in place to ensure that this doesn't happen again, the police may very well want to know that, because even though we may have, or, you know, whether or not we concluded that bullying did in fact occur, there may be instances in which we just don't think that it rises to the level of meeting that definition of bullying. And so we may not substantiate conduct. And then the parents may be quite upset with that, and may in turn turn to the police and say, well, the school didn't do anything, and so I want you to try to help me. And so in those instances, I think the police might turn to us and say, well, what is it that you did? Because we want to understand how you arrived at your conclusion. So, you know, we can't unfortunately divorce ourselves from law enforcement as it relates to bullying. But I think to me, it's very clear that we have an independent obligation to ensure that we have a safe environment for kids to learn in.
And is it necessary to detail the process of escalation? You know, just going back to when these egregious acts occur, and what is on the school to intervene and provide supports to kind of minimize harmful behavior from happening. If it's not working, what the school is doing, in which, you know, each situation is different and unique. It's, I don't know if it's supposed to be clear, but it's not clear at, you know, at what point, you know, you tag someone else in. At what point is it evident that this is beyond the school building to really respond to appropriately in a manner that minimizes it from happening, or, you know, checks the box for prevention. Do policies need to articulate what the procedures for escalation look like?
So when it comes to policies, and I think I may have mentioned this earlier, maybe I thought it. When it comes to policies, we're always of the opinion that less is more, because we don't want to overpromise and under-deliver. If we create an escalation procedure in place and we happen not to follow it for whatever reason, then we set ourselves up for a potential claim against the board. And so to answer your question specifically, are we required, should we have that? The answer is no, you're not required to. That being said, as a committee, you're certainly welcome to consider what you want your process to look like. And then we can certainly talk to you about what the ramifications or potential exposure is from a legal perspective of including such a procedure in it. So you're not required to, but you certainly, to the extent that the committee wants to consider that further, it's something we're happy to walk you through.
Yeah, thank you. And I would ask at what point the language turns into harassment. You know, and looking at bullying in terms of its consistency, intensity, you know, and the lack of responsiveness of school-based intervention to address it.
Yeah, well, I think you raise a very important question, which is at what point does it turn into harassment? Well, interestingly, that's a question that the legislature pondered for some time. And in changing the definition of bullying, they did just that. Bullying is now defined to be pretty much harassment. And so the definition is consistent with the definition of harassment generally. And so I think there may be two issues at play here. And so if I misunderstand them, please do correct me. But it sounds like there may be an issue with how is bullying defined, period. And I think we've concluded, or at least I've concluded in my mind, maybe by my lonesome, that we need to change the definition because your current definition is outdated as of last July. But I think the other issue, which might be more of a practical issue, and maybe that's something for the board to consider, is how are we implementing our bullying policy and our safe climate plan to prevent this from happening, or to ensure we address it in an expeditious and efficient manner? I think that's a separate issue, and it might be a performance issue for the superintendent to consider further. And I'll give you an example. I don't have much context for what's happening in the community, but I suspect that you raised the question because there have been some instances in which parents or others have been unhappy with the manner in which things have been handled, or the lack of intervention by the administration in response to some of these acts. And so what I would think would be helpful would be for the subcommittee or for the board to consider discussing that with the superintendent more generally and say, well, these are some of the concerns that we're hearing from our community members, or these are some of the concerns that I'm hearing from a parent or a constituent, or some of the things that my own child has witnessed, or what have you, that I think we need to address as a board. And they're questions that the superintendent may be able to give you more specific responses to.
Yeah. And last question, does bullying only occur in school?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And at least for the foreseeable future, the answer to that is no, because we have things like cyberbullying. It used to be much clearer, right? It used to be very clear that if things had a nexus to school, and if somehow it happened outside of school and it had a nexus to school and it affected one's ability to perform or to access their education in school, that we can intervene. But at least for the foreseeable future, we can address issues like cyberbullying, because those things very much affect a student's ability to be in a classroom with somebody that bullies them online, right? And so I think it's important to consider those issues, and it's a very, very good question.
So we still have some work to do.
We do have
Yes.
some.
We have a lot of work to do, especially in the written policy, but I wanted to also let the public know that, we take bullying very seriously.
For sure.
And just because we're having these conversations doesn't mean that we're not, following all kinds of protocols that the public doesn't see. Yes, we do get complaints. And like you said, Natalia, parents will, question things prior to sitting down with anyone, in office or with superintendent or its principal, without knowing what the details of the protocols. And like you said, there's also a separation between schools and the Norwalk Police Department and DCF, because once they get involved, we have to step back and let them do what they know what they're doing. So I just wanted to clarify that, yes, we have questions, especially Godfrey's very detailed questions, but I didn't want anyone to, misconstrue that and think that things are not being followed correctly at school level.
I think that's a very important point of clarification, Diana, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to add a little flavor to that as well, if I may. Here, from my understanding of how Norwalk is responding to these matters, irrespective of what your policy says, they are doing so in an appropriate way. It just, sometimes it takes a while for the paper to match the practice. And so, as the policy subcommittee has a lot of work to do. And so this one, although it has not been updated to reflect the current legislative standard, I do think that Norwalk has been handling these matters appropriately and responding to these incidents in a manner that is consistent with the law, at least as far as I understand it. So that's a very good point to make. The other thing, if I may just add, that your policy doesn't have, that I think it's important that we, that the board sort of identify and acknowledge for the public, is that we require our school employees to complete bullying training every year. And that is something that should be out there. And it's something that as a board, we should ensure is in our policy so that the world knows we're committed to this and it's consistent with a requirement under the law. So that is this area right here that's not currently included in your language. And again, I'll send you all of this so you'll have the model policy. I can send it to you just like this so that you have the model policy, but also see what's currently not in yours, and you can choose to revise it as you see fit.
Natalia, I just want to do a time check. We have 15 minutes remaining.
Oh, yes, yes.
So we have a hard stop. That's all. We're doing fine.
No, you're absolutely correct. I don't think there's anything else in here that I want to, because everything else is pretty self-explanatory. Those were the main issues.
Godfrey, I heard you weigh in again.
The training reference for bullying, is there one currently used in the same manner how mandated reporter training for the state is available and used?
I'm actually not sure about that. And I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not sure. It may be that the State Department of Ed has come up with one, and I can certainly look into that. I'm not sure, but I will find out.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just taking notes really quickly. We provide, just for whatever it's worth, we provide some bullying training to districts across the state. So to the extent that you would want that, one of my colleagues that does bullying work specifically could certainly provide that. But I'll confirm whether there's a standard one like the model DCF one that we could circulate as well.
Thank you.
Of course. All right, so let me just take this, stop sharing so I can see your faces. Perfect. So how else can I help? There was one other question that you had as it relates to bullying in the context of employees. Is that something you want me to just address quickly before the end of the meeting, or?
Yes, please.
So I took a look at the current policy and, or the workplace, essentially bullying and policy. And there are some districts across the state that have that policy. It is not unusual, but it's also not common. And the reason why it may not be common, or why I think it's not common, is because typically boards of education rely on policies like the harassment and discrimination policy to address instances related to interpersonal conflict between employees. And one thing that's interesting about bullying in the workplace is that there have been several attempts at the legislature to introduce legislation related to bullying in the workplace. All of that legislation has ultimately failed. And so there's currently no law about bullying in the workplace. We have harassment laws, discrimination laws, sexual harassment laws, but we don't have a bullying law. And that's the main reason why we don't have a model policy on bullying in the workplace, because it is not legally required, because it's not legally defined. But again, that doesn't mean you can't have one. It's just that most districts tend to err on the side of following their harassment and discrimination procedures to address those instances, because unless there's a legal definition of bullying and what you're looking for, kind of hard to substantiate something. You know, if you don't know what you're looking for because it has not been defined for you, then how do you make that determination? It's a little bit difficult. In the context of harassment and discrimination, there are very specific definitions and there are very specific standards. So it's very easy to analyze conduct under that rubric. So that's my little short synopsis on that. If you want me to provide you some more specific advice as it relates to that, I'm happy to. But I think the one thing that I would just ask you to consider in the first instance is whether or not you want to have a workplace bullying policy moving forward. And if you do, I'm happy to review it. If not, we can certainly take a look at your harassment and discrimination policies and see if those need to be updated in some way to address some of the concerns that are raised by way of this workplace bullying policy.
I'm not too interested in the adult bullying, mainly because when looking at harassment, it can be experienced on behalf of someone that received it from a student. There are lines that fall on harassment, and there's a response to that. But adult bullying only isolates it from adult to adult, which, two people above 18, you're looking, the discussion falls back to harassment, in terms of what's substantiated, I'm assuming, in the investigation are all things that are along the lines of what defines observable activities of harassment. That's, my rationale for not caring to go down that conversation. What are your thoughts, Diana?
Well, I think it's twofold, because you can separate the two, but then at the same time combine it into the wording of the harassment policy. But I do believe that we have to have a discussion where it's student to adult, adult to student. The adult ones, we'll probably have to update. But thinking about all of this, there's a lot to discuss. Like I said earlier, we'll definitely have to have, sounds to me like we have to have a special meeting, especially since we're missing 2 board members today, but we'll have this discussion. And I look forward for Natalia's information to be sent to us so that we can review it separately. And then when we come together, have more detailed discussions. This is definitely a very difficult topic to discuss. Because we don't want to miss anything or misconstrue anything. And I know that staff is looking at us also to see how all of this is going to affect them moving forward. But with that being said, it is 6:21 and I know we have a hard stop. So if there's any other last minute questions, otherwise, if we can motion to adjourn because we need to get ready for our next meeting. And thank you so much, Natalia, for joining us.
Of course.
And we look forward to having you again. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for you.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here. All right. I'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks,
care.
Natalia.
Okay. Thank you.
Motion to
Thank you,
adjourn.
Brenda. Motion to adjourn. All in favor? Us too? Yay. Let's go. Thank you.
Unanimous.
Good night.
Bye.
Take care.
See you soon. Bye.